Hey everyone, welcome back to Beyond the Checklist, where we talk about the people, processes, and innovations that are shaping modern pharmaceutical manufacturing. I'm Brad Henry, Vice President of Service Lines at Performance Validation, and today we're diving into a topic that's fundamental to regulated manufacturing, and that is temperature mapping. So to help us unpack this, we're joined by Paul Daniel. Paul is a senior regulatory compliance expert at Vaisala. And Paul brings over 20 years of experience in environmental monitoring, clean room compliance, and of course, temperature mapping. He's worked with companies all over the world, helping them navigate regulatory expectations and build smarter validation strategies. So Paul, great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brad. Happy to be here.
All right. I guess before we dive into the topic at hand, just share a little bit about your career path, what drew you or sucked you into validation and eventually made you specialize in temperature mapping.
The short story, Brad, is I was drawn to pharma and GMP because I needed a job. There's no dramatic story arc there back in 1997. It was long enough ago that this job, getting it, involved an actual classified ad in an actual paper newspaper. It said something like validation technician, science degree required, no experience necessary, will train. That got me a job with a small on-site consultancy, literally a mom and pop shop. I was the first employee who wasn't an owner. And my very first task was calibrating thermocouples for temperature mapping. But the spirit of your question really is like not what drew me to validation, but why did I stay? And I think that's a real worthwhile question for a little known profession that is sometimes unpopular, right? And for me, somewhere in the stacks of the details and specifications and requirements, I was able to find a flow, like this little Zen space. So a lot of the work was kind of like a meditation with data. And compared to my other options at the time, it paid pretty well. But what really kept me there was knowing that the work had a purpose, that my conscience was always clean. It's not glamorous work, but I know that at the end of the day, it ensures higher quality medicines, which does some small part to improve the quality of life for everybody. And then when I found Vaisala, things got, really fun. I just said fun and validation in the same sentence. But anyway, by this time, I'd moved towards working with vendors exclusively as a conscious career strategy. And that was better. By this time, I'd specialized in computer validation. And when you're representing a vendor, that validation guy is seen a little bit more as a hero. Whereas when you work for that pharma company directly, you get internally seen as a bit of a policeman. So the political side was much better. And once I was with Vaisala, now I was working with a company that made best-in-class products, no matter what product we're talking about. So I got to both work with the best system, best-in-class system, as well as make the world a better place. And mapping, as part of validation, it's pretty unique. Maybe not unique, but I think what people don't realize with old school validation, once you get out of computer validation, things like mapping, things like process validation, is you get to go work with things, stuff you can physically touch and play with. And that's not common for information workers. Usually you're just pushing files around. So with that hands-on experience, it was weirdly satisfying. And you get to work with your hands, run little experiments like a little independent scientist. And that's why I got into mapping and validation.
No, very good. it's been, like you said, a couple decades. I think you said 97, so maybe getting closer to 3 decades than 2. Back when when chart recorders were still high tech, maybe. But compared to where we are today, just talking about that. That evolution, technology, particularly related to mapping. You've seen a lot. Seen a lot of change over many years. And what are the major trends you've seen that have shaped how you execute, how you approach temperature mapping today?
Well, my first mapping ever, right? It was almost exactly 28 years ago, give or take a month, and a lot has changed. Not only was it a long time ago, but at the time, I was already using outdated equipment. So I've gotten to see something effectively more than a 28-year span, probably closer to a 40-year span of equipment. And that equipment it got a lot better. I mean, a lot better. I mean, you can still get the job done with the old stuff, but modern data loggers, modern software, it's just so much easier. You drop a lot of manual steps that aren't required anymore, so you're saving time. And anytime you take out a manual step, you're decreasing your chances of errors. So you're better in newer equipment. It just pays for itself really quick. And I think that's something that new mappers, they just don't understand, especially when they try and do it on a small budget. There is a trend in there that, God, it's been really interesting for me lately, and it had a big impact on what I've done with Vizsla, and that was the advent of good distribution practices. So if you go all the way back to the late 90s, there were some studies done that revealed the really high temperatures that could be seen by GMP products during shipment. I'm talking like 50 degrees Celsius, maybe even 60 degrees Celsius. And with the slow churning of our regulatory wheels, that led up to GDP regulations showing up in like 2011. I think the first one showed up. And for the first time ever, we had regulations stating that temperature mapping was required. I think the first one was that Canadian GUI 0069. Now, you and I know that mapping had been the GMP solution to prove stability in controlled environments. But now, rather than just a tool in our toolbox, it became an explicit written regulatory requirement. And it really didn't change a thing for pharma manufacturers or medical device manufacturers, the people that I call like core GMP. But it really changed mapping for distributors, Now they were expected to do it. So the people that had to comply, that group of people got a lot bigger. But you had less enforcement, right? Because you've got 100,000 pharmacies compared to maybe 1,000 manufacturers, a much bigger audience with a much smaller budget for compliance. But these new GDP regs, it made it official. Mapping and monitoring were now required by law, and a much bigger group of people needed to comply. So we saw new regulations. This also brought new guidance, some of which I was lucky enough to help write. The ISP Good Practice Guide for Mapping and Monitoring of CTUs, second edition. If you look in there, you'll see my name in there and the contributors. But in those documents, they added some really complicated practices. There was often some conflicting information and really some serious misunderstandings about why mapping matters and how it should be done. But the biggest difference, though, in this trend, this change, is now that you've got a distribution side of things, people with, they're kind of working outside the umbrella of that strict QMS that we expect at a pharma manufacturer. And without that QMS container giving you some level of control, you got to ask, how do you even do validation? And because mapping is validation, what happens when you do mapping in that kind of environment? So that is where I've been focusing a lot as things develop to help these people with fewer resources do as good of a mapping as they can to instill some quality in the process. But you still can't do it all because you don't have your QMS umbrella to ensure that it's all going to work.
Talk about technology and obviously that evolution, that constant evolution. Obviously, real-time monitoring, automated alerts, things that maybe we're just getting going, in the olden days, if you will. I've heard people say, I'm doing all this monitoring. I have all these alerts. Why do I even need to map? I'm mapping all the time. So, we talk about why, mapping versus monitoring, kind of why mapping remains, still a critical, distinct practice relative to monitoring, which obviously, Vizsla is, well entrenched in.
Yeah, I think this monitor versus map is a symptom of the difference between GDP and GMP, right? In GDP, they usually, because they have a smaller budget, they don't have that strong QMS, and without the strong QMS, there's no structure of overall control to make sure that no one's changing the set points on the freezer or on the warehouse. And in that kind of environment, you can't truly validate. You can't truly map the way you and I understand it. But what you can do in that GDP world, if you have a weak quality management system, you can put in a monitoring system, and that becomes something you can control. It's much easier to control and protect that single server than it is to try and control and protect 100 different refrigerators. So this is just my theory, supported by a lot of anecdotal evidence and stories. But I think that when you have a limited budget and limited QA and control, you're going to get more quality out of a single monitoring system than you will out of mapping 100 refrigerators. But I am not saying that temperature mapping is obsolete. Absolutely not. It's a core validation practice with GMP manufacturers, and you get a lot of value out of mapping when you do it with a strong QMS. I think people, especially, I think people forget, but it's actually new people haven't learned that mapping really is qualification. It is validation. And when you treat it as validation, it proves that your unit or the area you're qualifying is capable of holding the required temperature range in every part of the chamber. And that proof, that documented evidence, for a CTU being operated in a state of control as part of a controlled quality management system, this is what gives us the faith necessary to place something expensive or sensitive, $1 million of vaccines inside that chamber in the first place. If you don't map, you're simply gambling with your product. And if you're monitoring only one location in an area that hasn't been mapped, you actually have no idea what temperatures your product is actually experiencing. Why don't you know? Well, because you didn't map. But we can take this a few steps farther, and there will be a day when mapping becomes obsolete. But that day is not this day. For that to happen, we're going to need to have accurate sensors available at a low enough price that we can monitor with the same number of sensors that we would have used for mapping anyway. That's when mapping becomes obsolete. But for that to happen, we would need to see a big drop in the price of sensors and in the price or effort to calibrate those sensors. So you give me cheap, accurately, easily network sensors that don't need calibration, and that's your day when mapping becomes obsolete. Until then, it's here to stay.
So, obviously you've been involved with, we talked a little bit about guidance documents. You've been involved in helping develop those to at least put some bounds and guidance documents as they're stated around this practice. But obviously there's no golden bullet, no one size solution for every mapping challenge. I guess, thinking about pitfalls, what are some mistakes or misunderstandings that you see companies make when they are executing mapping studies?
Yeah, well, certainly the biggest mistake, or you said mistakes and misconceptions. Okay, the misconception is going to be not understanding that mapping is a validation. Validation is not intuitive, and validation is hard. And if you haven't worked within that established and sophisticated quality culture, you're just going to lack the fundamental conceptual framework to really even understand what validation is. That skill set, that experience is really only found in core GMP companies, pharma, medical devices. And there's so much more to mapping than just sticking data loggers in a refrigerator for a day and seeing what happens. But if you don't know that, if you don't understand the underpinnings and foundation of validation sitting on top of data integrity and how a quality management system operates, you're simply not going to be able to do a mapping correctly. And you won't even understand why you can't do it. So you'll go do your temperature mapping, you'll put some data loggers in the refrigerator, and sure, they'll gather some data, but it'll be relatively meaningless without the structure that's provided by the validation process. And you certainly won't have proven anything about the area where you performed your so-called mapping. I think the best we can do here is call that maybe a temperature profile. Gives you a little understanding of how the equipment works, but you haven't proven that it's a safe place to store your expensive products. And then there's a big mistake That was the misconception, the mistake, is that people skip on equipment. The most common question that I get from prospective mappers is they say, can I map with this cheap $20 data logger that has plus or minus 2 Celsius accuracy? Well, I could do it. Brad, you could do it. We can do it because we know how to compensate for the limitations of the device. And we would have at least a small chance of doing a successful mapping if everything else went perfect. So yes, an expert has a chance of doing it. But the person asking that question, by virtue of the very fact that they're asking the question, they aren't an expert. So no, they can't map with that cheap logger. Even a veteran mapper like you or me has a high chance of failure because mapping, it won't go perfectly. Something always goes wrong. And that's what the deviation process is there for, right? We expect things to go wrong. And better equipment will give you better data, which will get you through those deviations more easily, more successfully. And it's simply better to spend the money on an accurate, reliable device if you want to have a prayer of a successful temperature mapping, especially if you're not an expert. The superior equipment can make up to some degree for the mistakes that are inevitable, especially for a beginner mapper.
Couple things there I wanted to follow up on, but the first one, you mentioned data integrity, and obviously a big buzzword these days, and not to treat it as a buzzword as something to toss aside, because obviously it's very critical to what we do. I mean, like with most validations, temperature mapping is all about the data. So in terms of the regulators, FDA, EMA, and others, when they're looking at temperature mapping studies, I guess what are you seeing, in terms of trends or focus? But I guess particularly related with data integrity to balance data integrity with compliance and meet the expectations of today's regulatory expectations.
I hate to promote compliance through fear, but warning letters are still a really good source. And I usually look at the FDA warnings simply because they provide more visibility into those warning letters online. It's harder to find stuff from the EMA. And if you look at the letters and see what types of things auditors are noticing, right? They use specifics of one topic to dig deeper into the quality system in general. So what does that mean for mapping? It means that auditor, he primarily doesn't really care about your mapping protocol. He doesn't really care about your mapping data. They're looking for errors, say a failure to properly verify the calibration of your sensors, right? So then from there, they ask about your calibration verification SOP. Then they'll ask about revision control of your SOP. Then they'll ask for the training records of your SOP. And through this method, they'll drill down and eventually find the fundamental flaws in your quality system. It's like examining a sweater to find that thread you can pull on that will make that whole thing unravel. And so when there's an observation, it's going to be for a failure in your quality management system or a data integrity failure. So if they ask to see a mapping protocol, they're just using it as a window, right, to look deeper into your quality system. I realize that may not be a really helpful answer to your audience. So if I was going to try and build the best mapping to survive an audit by the FDA, I'd look at the basic data integrity stuff, failure to approve documents before you execute them, failure to calibrate correctly, failure to follow your protocol, failure to validate your mapping software, and of course, all the basic good documentation practice failures if you're doing paper execution, not filling out your data fields, not dating with the right dating convention, or not getting stuff signed, either for review or approval. And if you're doing that, it means you've got a robust quality management system that's already telling you how to do these things, and you're not providing loose threads for that auditor to tug on.
Yeah, I agree. I think it provides a window into your general quality culture. You hit check all those boxes.
Yeah, they're just looking for the symptom somewhere.
Yeah,
of a deeper disease.
The other, from the previous answer, talked about technology, and going back to the beginning of the conversation, we talked about chart recorders, and then some of these $20 kind of throwaway loggers. But I mean, generally speaking, technology in all spaces is evolving fast, but certainly with the mapping and monitoring as well. So I guess recent innovations maybe that have caught your eye or impressed you, things that particularly validation professionals should keep an eye on within this space.
Yeah, innovations. An obvious but simple innovation that I absolutely love. The use of RTDs over thermocouples. The increased stability of that RTD sensor simplifies the old pre-cal, post-cal process and saves a ton of time and documentation. I know it's not a recent innovation, but it stands out for me as one of the most important. And you'll remember that I've used a lot of really old equipment in my time. So another big innovation that I love is data loggers with a lot of memory, so you don't have to worry about losing data. Again, not a new innovation, but I started temperature mapping with data logging systems that had paper printouts. And when you ran out of paper, you literally ran out of memory. So I'd have to go in on weekends to load the paper tray so we didn't lose data. Another thing that really impresses me is the development of whole software systems around mapping that make the workflow of data logger management and report creation just so much simpler and easier. Again, not a recent change, but still, I think those three together have the biggest impact. And speaking of these developments in mapping equipment as innovations, they're not anymore. They're just expected functionality in a mapping solution, right? But if you haven't used older equipment, you just don't know how good you've got it with these newer systems. There's another change, which really isn't technology change in mapping equipment, but it's this beginning move away from simply rote scheduled remapping. Say you're going to remap that fridge every 1 year, every 3 years, every 5 years, and moving towards a risk assessment to determine if remapping is warranted. This is one of the big reasons why they did a rev to that ISPE Good Practice Guide, was to make that portion of the guide align with their other guides on commissioning and qualification. And we took advantage of that edit cycle to do some updates to mapping and monitoring. But this big evolution away from scheduled remapping could really remove some busy work from the mapping world, so we can focus our mapping efforts on the places that provide the most benefit. I mean, the best solution to making your work more efficient is realizing that you don't need to do that work in the first place.
Yeah, and there's obviously the equipment component of this, and the internal the people side of it. To the people that are going to be doing the work, right? So, I know Vaisala works with companies all over the world, varying sizes, varying markets. But internally, I guess what do you see companies think about in terms of designing their mapping strategy and the decision to handle that internally versus bringing in specialists? When they kind of make that make or buy decision, and how they carry out some of these complex mapping requirements.
That question could be a podcast in itself, man. But you said it right when you say we've got different temperature mapping tools or designing a strategy. There are different tools that are best for different jobs, right? This isn't just for mapping, but for anything, which hides the answer inside this, right? So imagine automotive repair. If you don't know what the right tool is for the repair, it probably means you shouldn't do the repair yourself. This is when you go get an external expert, like a mechanic, and have them do it. Because if you don't know the tool, it's outside of your capability. You can pull up a stool if they let you, and you can watch them do it, so you learn how to do it. My neighbors around here know me as pretty handy around the house, and I have this fence I built along the sidewalk. I like it a lot, but I get a lot of compliments. And my neighbors asked me how I learned to build such a nice fence. And what I did is I hired someone to build one section of the fence in the backyard. I watched them do it really closely, took pictures like any concerned homeowner, And I learned by watching their example. And then I built a section in the front, following what I learned. I wasn't as fast as them, but I got it done. For a strategy like that to work, though, I had to already have the tools, and I had to have the supporting experience in using those tools from doing other similar work. To kind of dumb that down, I already needed to have a shovel and saw, and I needed experience digging holes and cutting wood. So if you take that back to mapping, if you don't know how to do it, if you don't know which tools are the right tools, hire an expert. It's the best way to learn. And these are expensive tools we're talking about. Good data loggers and mapping equipment just isn't cheap. And if that investment in tools seems like it's too much money, you should probably hire an expert, because it means you won't do the job very often. If you know that you're going to do the job enough times, the cost of that tool gets kind of amortized over time and becomes comparably more affordable. So how does that play out in mapping? If you don't know how to do it, hire someone. If you think the tools are too expensive for how often you're going to use them, hire someone. If you find that hiring people to do mapping for you is too expensive, then maybe it is time to bring it in-house and create a mapping program at your organization. And that will involve buying equipment, learning some skills, hiring some employees. And you'll know when you hit that point. But the difficulty is when you know that you've hit that point, you got to get someone to help you pay for your new mapping program. And that conversation with management is probably never fun. But another really important part of a mapping strategy isn't the mapping itself. It's a higher level than that, and it's kind of included in. You have to include mapping in your overall master validation plan for your site. This gives you an idea of the scope of the work, how often you're going to need to repeat it, so you can develop a strategy that works for your organization. It isn't rocket science, but in general, your mapping strategy and approach is an extension of your quality management system. And having that stuff embedded in your validation master plan will help you understand how often you need to do it, so you can make these basically business choices about whether you hire someone or try and bring that in-house.
I appreciate that. I know you're a storyteller. We've learned at least that, right? People learn best from stories. These are the things that resonate. So, I'm sure you have a lot of war stories, but maybe just an example or a couple, if you have them, from some complex mapping projects that you've worked with, whether it's an automated warehouse or cryogenic storage or something that just presented a singular challenge.
I'm going to be a little challenged to give you a meaningful answer there, or at least one that comes from personal experience. Most of my hands-on experience, predates things like automated warehouses. I simply wasn't the principal investigator on projects like those. I've been a witness watching from the sidelines plenty of times. But I do have a few ideas or concepts that might be useful. I love automated warehouses. They're just cool to watch. And so now you're going to have an environment with new and novel heat sources, maybe battery chargers for the robots or something. So, our traditional ideas about temperature dynamics and temperature gradients, they might not apply the same way. The other thing that I hear when you say automated warehouse, I think that this might actually make mapping easier, because if my warehouse is automated, that means there's some robotic system for picking and sorting packages. That means there's a robotic system built into the warehouse that I can use to place and retrieve my data loggers. So all of a sudden, my mapping could be much easier in an automated warehouse, because I don't need to get myself up 5 meters to the top of a rack to go place a sensor. I can have the robot do it, and then OSHA doesn't need to get involved. Wait, no, there was one mapping project I did, Brad. It was the most challenging one I've ever did. It was mapping UV light penetration to kill HIV virus in a custom apparatus. They had to do it with UV light at the time to keep the viral structure intact, because they wanted to use it to develop HIV test kits. This is back in the time before DNA technology really became dominant in its application. But that UV light was so intense, it would heat up the samples and denature them. So the samples had to sit in an ice bath while they got blasted by the UV. Long story short, it simply couldn't be done. There were no UV sensors with the right sensitivity. The ice bath with the ice cubes in there was so irregular we couldn't effectively place sensors. And the inverse square law, which describes how radiation disperses over distance, it meant that we needed different sensitivity sensors at different points in the bath. But what we found out is it just couldn't be done. So why does that story matter at all to your question? It's simply to say that mapping may not always be the answer. In this case, it was better to validate the process using some other metric for viral kill than accumulated UV. So it's kind of analogous to mapping an autoclave and getting lethality from steam. So when you're faced with mapping a challenging environment, which really means validating a challenging process, there simply might be a better way to approach it than mapping. Mapping's just a tool, and sometimes it's not the right tool. And one other thing that you mentioned earlier about calling in experts, if you look at a product and you go, this one's going to be challenging, that could be an indicator that it's a good time to call in the experts and have someone else do that one.
I guess as we get close to the end of our time, obviously, it's been a long time with Vysla. A lot of people, most people, think of environmental monitoring. At least, that's my conception. But in the temperature mapping space, and obviously, that's where you have a lot of expertise. We talk about Vysla's approach or evolution relative to mapping versus monitoring. In terms of just thought processes, or obviously the technology that Vysla has or is developing.
At Vysla, we're always trying to make our stuff better. I mean, people know our products; they know they're always best in class. In the last years, we've really been focusing on the monitoring side of the business. And I'm in the process right now of trying to remind people that our ViewLink monitoring software can be a great mapping tool. And we're introducing people to our next generation of data loggers, which uses an absolutely world-class wireless protocol to get secure data transmission across really long ranges. That techno speak practically means that you can map a huge warehouse and see that data live as it's acquired. So now you can determine if your qualification is meeting your acceptance criteria during the qualification, right? And we're all used to that capability with short-range data loggers in like refrigerators or with the right kind of RF loggers. You can do it in an autoclave. But let me tell you, in a warehouse, it's really an absolute game changer. I mean, really think about that. There's so much labor involved in getting a data logger placed 25 feet up, in a big warehouse. To do that, you need a team of two. You need specialized equipment like a lift to safely place and retrieve it, to be in alignment with OSHA regulations. And it's really a bit of a downer to go through all that work to discover that your data has been out of spec. So now you can know if your data is good before you retrieve the data loggers. And if the data doesn't meet your acceptance criteria, you can do the adjustments you need to adjust the warehouse set points, restart that qualification. I think it's the best way I can think of to ensure a successful warehouse qualification. And we're really hoping that it's appreciated by the mapping world.
I guess just to tie a bow on it, with your your sage wisdom over many years, a key lesson, piece of advice that you share with folks that are taking on their first or maybe their highest stakes mapping project in the field. What's Paul Daniels' words of wisdom to share?
Patience. That's the best advice I have for mapping, and it's really generic for any kind of validation. Patience is your friend. Things take the time they take. You're just going to have stress when you have a desired timeline that's out of touch with reality. Slow is steady, steady is fast. And if you can kind of find the flow and match that pace, then validation can at least be peaceful, even if it's never going to be fun. My best example of this is in like old school good documentation practices. I have the worst handwriting ever, which doesn't play well in an industry where data integrity requires that your data be recorded legibly. And I found that if I want to do that, record data legibly, I have to focus on one word at a time. If I think about the whole sentence, I'll rush to the end. And as I do it, my writing's just going to end up absolutely messy. But if I write one word at a time, my writing always stays legible. So don't try to rush it. This takes some work to get your upper management or your clients to understand how long it takes to do something correctly. You got to manage expectations, especially with people that have never done this type of work themselves. Another good example would be calibration, right? Waiting for equilibration and stabilization of a measurement. That is the job, right? Waiting is the job with calibration. If you try and rush things, or worse yet, you try to multitask, it's just going to be a road to misery, to guaranteed errors. And sometimes you can even hurt yourself. When you're mapping an autoclave, there's sharp metal in there. It's hot enough to burn you at the same time. And if you're working fast, you're going to hurt yourself. If we had a high enough resolution camera that wouldn't, blur it out, I can actually show you scars on my body from burns and cuts that I've gotten while doing validation. And the end result of patience in this is going to be a happier, more productive you, a version of you that happens to enjoy your work while you do good work with fewer errors. And another side of patience, I would say, is never be afraid of a deviation, right? Deviations are an important part of the process. They're maybe the most important part of the process, because it's through deviations and resolving them, we actually learn how things work and why they work that way. We go from the theoretical on paper specifications to what the system actually do. And it'll make you better at validation overall. A qualification with no deviations doesn't mean it was perfect, right? It could mean that you weren't looking close enough to see the problems, or that you spent too much time preparing your documentation. Let's say a deviation overall costs you 2 hours. But if you spend 8 extra hours of work to avoid the deviation, maybe you weren't all that efficient, It's a process. Give time for the process to work, and all the parts of the process are there for a reason.
Very good. Yeah, and I was mentioning storytelling. Those deviations, that package, that's the story. Is it, are you telling the story? Doesn't have to be funny or exciting. It probably shouldn't be, but you need to understand what happened along the way, and that package, those deviations. Those are what tell that story.
Data integrity is really, is there a story? Is it consistent? Is it coherent? And can I rely on that story to understand what decisions were made, why they were made, and make future decisions based off that story?
All right. Well, I think that wraps up the session for today. Paul, really appreciate you taking some time out for us today. See a lot of great insights, some good reminders about, again, why this work matters. Why do we do what we do? But anyone wants to hear more conversations like this, you can find Beyond the Checklist on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about this conversation or any ideas you'd like to see for future episodes, we'd love to hear from those as well. But until then, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.